The dusty silence of St. Magdalene's Convent had remained unbroken for over 4 decades, its weathered stone walls keeping their secrets buried beneath layers of neglect and forgotten prayers. But on a cold October morning in 2024, Renovation, worker Jake Morrison pried open a sealed compartment behind the altar and discovered something that would shatter the peaceful facade of this abandoned holy ground forever. Hidden within the cramped space, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against time itself, lay a leather-bound diary bearing the unmistakable seal of the Daughters of Divine Mercy. As Jake's trembling fingers opened to the final entry, dated just days before 5 young nuns vanished without a trace in 1984, he had no idea that the bone-chilling words scrawled across those yellowed pages would expose a horrifying truth that had been deliberately buried by those sworn to protect. What unspeakable secret had driven 5 devoted women to disappear into the night? And why had someone gone to such desperate lengths to ensure their story would never be told? The answers lay waiting in that diary's pages, ready to reveal a conspiracy so disturbing it would challenge everything the world believed about faith, trust, and the dark power of silence. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the interior of St. Magdalene's Convent, his construction boots echoing against the marble floors that hadn't felt human footsteps in decades. At 42, Jake had renovated dozens of old buildings throughout rural Pennsylvania. But something about this place felt different. The morning light filtering through stained glass windows cast eerie shadows across walls that seemed to whisper of forgotten sorrows. The Diocese of Millfield had hired Morrison Construction to transform the abandoned convent into a community center, a project that should have been straightforward. The building had been empty since 1984, when the last of the Daughters of Divine Mercy had supposedly been transferred to other parishes. At least, that's what the official records claimed. But Jake had grown up in Millfield, and he remembered the whispered conversations that had circulated through town 40 years ago, hushed speculation about 5 young nuns who had simply vanished one autumn night, leaving behind only questions and carefully crafted explanations from church officials: Sister Catherine Brennan, Sister Mary Francis, Sister Elizabeth Carmel, Sister Rose Margaret, and Sister Anna Teresa. Jake had looked up their names in the local library's archives the night before, curiosity getting the better of him. All 5 had been in their 20s and 30s, devoted women who had taken their vows with joy and served the community with distinction. The newspaper accounts from 1984 were frustratingly vague, mentioning only that the sisters had been reassigned to missions abroad and would be greatly missed by the Millfield community. But Jake's grandmother had told a different story before she passed away 10 years ago. She'd spoken of strange lights in the convent windows during the sisters' final weeks, of hushed phone calls and midnight visitors, of Sister Catherine's obvious distress when she'd come to buy groceries in town just days before the disappearance. Something wasn't right, his grandmother had insisted, her weathered hands gripping Jake's with surprising strength. Those girls were scared of something, and then they were just gone. No goodbyes, no forwarding addresses. It wasn't natural. Jake had dismissed these stories as small-town gossip, the kind of urban legends that grew around any abandoned building. But now, standing in the actual space where those 5 women had lived and prayed, he found himself wondering what had really happened during those final days at St. Magdalene's. The renovation work had been progressing smoothly for 3 weeks. Jake's crew had cleared out decades of accumulated debris, replaced broken windows, and begun updating the electrical systems. The main chapel, with its soaring ceiling and ornate altar, would become the centerpiece of the new community center. Jake had saved this room for last, knowing it would require the most delicate work to preserve its historical character while making it functional for modern use. It was while examining the altar's structure that Jake first noticed the inconsistency. The carved wooden base appeared solid, but his experienced eye detected a subtle difference in the wood grain along one section. When he tapped the surface with his hammer, it produced a hollow sound that shouldn't have been there. Further investigation revealed what appeared to be a carefully concealed compartment, sealed with wax and nearly invisible, unless viewed from exactly the right angle. Jake's pulse quickened as he carefully pried open the hidden space. His grandmother's. Stories suddenly didn't seem quite so far-fetched. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide something unless it contained information that certain people wanted to keep buried? The compartment was small, perhaps 18 inches square and 6 inches deep, but it had been crafted with obvious care. The interior was lined with what looked like tin to protect against moisture, and everything inside had been wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved its contents remarkably well. Jake's hands shook slightly as he lifted out the bundle, unwrapping it with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient treasure. The diary was bound in brown leather, its cover embossed with the seal of the Daughters of Divine Mercy. The leather was cracked with age but still intact, and the pages inside were yellowed but legible. Jake opened to the first entry and saw Sister Catherine Brennan's name written in neat cursive at the top of the page, dated January 15th, 1984. As Jake flipped through the pages, he could see that the entries began normally enough. Sister Catherine wrote about daily prayers, community service projects, and the small joys and challenges of convent life. Her handwriting was careful and controlled, reflecting the discipline and education of her religious training. But as the months progressed, Jake noticed subtle changes in both the content and the physical appearance of the entries. By spring, Sister Catherine's writing had become more hurried, more urgent. She wrote about troubling developments and concerns that cannot be ignored. References appeared to Father Mackenzie's unusual requests and questions that Sister Mary Frances has been asking. The handwriting itself became less controlled, as if written quickly or under stress. Jake found himself completely absorbed in Sister Catherine's account, forgetting about the renovation work as he read about the growing tension within the convent community. It became clear that something significant was happening behind the scenes, something that was causing considerable distress to the sisters. The entries from summer 1984 painted a picture of increasing paranoia and fear. Sister Catherine wrote about being watched, about conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, about documents that had been moved or had gone missing entirely. She mentioned heated discussions between the sisters, disagreements about what should be done and who could be trusted. One entry from July particularly caught Jake's attention. Sister Rose Margaret came to me in tears today. She said she couldn't bear the weight of what she knows any longer. I tried to comfort her, but how can I offer peace when I myself am tormented by the same knowledge? Father Mackenzie's visits have become more frequent and his questions more pointed. I fear we are all in terrible danger. Jake's mouth went dry as he read these words. This wasn't the account of peaceful religious women going about their daily devotions. This was the record of people living in fear, people who had discovered something that put them at risk. The handwriting in the final weeks before the disappearance became increasingly erratic. Sister Catherine's usually neat script deteriorated into frantic scrawls, with some words nearly illegible and entire passages crossed out as if she'd thought better of recording certain information. She wrote about sleepless nights, about plans being made in whispered conversations, about the terrible choice between speaking the truth and preserving their own safety. And then Jake reached the final entry, dated October 12, 1984, just 3 days before the 5 nuns had vanished forever. His hands trembled as he read Sister Catherine's last recorded words, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely recognizable as coming from the same person who had penned those careful early entries. The words on that final page would haunt Jake for the rest of his life, revealing a truth so disturbing that he immediately understood why someone had been desperate enough to seal this diary away where it might never be found. Sister Catherine's final entry exposed not just the reason for their disappearance, but the horrifying reality of what had been happening within the walls of St. Magdalene's Convent during those final months. As Jake read those bone-chilling final sentences, he realized that the 5 missing nuns hadn't simply been reassigned to missions abroad. They had discovered something that powerful people would kill to keep secret, and their disappearance hadn't been a voluntary departure, but a desperate flight from unspeakable danger. The truth had been buried for 40 years, but now it was about to come to light, and Jake Morrison found himself holding evidence that would shatter the carefully constructed lies that had protected monsters hiding behind religious authority. The diary in his hands contained enough explosive information to destroy reputations, topple institutions, and potentially put his own life at risk. But as he stared at Sister Catherine's final, desperate words, Jake knew there was no going back. The 5 nuns of St. Magdalene's had paid the ultimate price for trying to expose the truth, and their courage demanded that their story finally be told, no matter the consequences. Jake Morrison's hands trembled as he closed the diary, the weight of Sister Catherine's final words pressing down on him like a physical force. The silence in the abandoned chapel felt different now, charged with the echoes of secrets that had festered in darkness for 4 decades. He looked around the empty space, imagining 5 young women kneeling at these very pews, their prayers interrupted by the growing terror that would eventually drive them from this place forever. The renovation work that had seemed so straightforward just hours earlier now felt like an archaeological dig into a crime scene. Every shadow in the chapel seemed to harbor hidden meaning. Every crack in the stone walls whispered of the fear that had permeated this place during those final months of 1984. Jake found himself studying the altar where he'd discovered the diary, wondering what other secrets might be hidden within these walls. He carefully rewrapped the leather-bound journal in its protective oilcloth, his mind racing with questions that Sister Catherine's entries had raised rather than answered. The diary painted a picture of mounting terror, but the specific details of what the nuns had discovered remained frustratingly vague. References to Father Mackenzie's unusual requests and knowledge that cannot be borne suggested something far more sinister than typical church politics or administrative disputes. Jake's construction crew wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, giving him time to process what he'd found and decide on his next course of action. The rational part of his mind insisted he should simply report the discovery to the diocese officials who had hired him for the renovation. But something in Sister Catherine's increasingly desperate tone warned him that involving church authorities might not be the wisest choice. If her fears had been justified, then the very people she'd been afraid of might still be in positions of power 40 years later. He walked slowly through the convent's empty corridors, the diary tucked securely in his jacket pocket. Each room told its own story of abandonment. Dormitories where beds still held their thin mattresses, a kitchen with pots still hanging from hooks on the wall, a library where books remained arranged on shelves as if their readers might return at any moment. The hasty nature of the evacuation was evident everywhere Jake looked. This hadn't been an orderly transfer to other parishes. This had been a flight. In what had once been Sister Catherine's private cell, Jake found further evidence of the rapid departure. A small wooden cross lay forgotten on the floor beside the narrow bed, and a few personal items remained scattered on the simple desk by the window. He opened the desk's single drawer and found yellowed papers that appeared to be drafts of letters, most crossed out and abandoned before completion. One partial letter caught his attention, written in Sister Catherine's familiar handwriting, but never finished. My dearest Margaret, I know it has been too long since I last wrote, but circumstances here have become increasingly difficult. I cannot speak openly of what we have discovered, but I fear for our safety. If something should happen to us, please know that we tried to do what was right, even when... The letter ended there, the ink trailing off as if Sister Catherine had been interrupted or had lost the courage to continue. Jake carefully folded the fragment and placed it with the diary. Whatever the 5 nuns had uncovered, it had been serious enough to make them consider the possibility that they might not survive to tell their story. As he continued his exploration of the abandoned convent, Jake began to notice details that his construction-focused mindset had previously overlooked. Scratch marks around several door locks suggested hasty attempts to secure rooms. In the Mother Superior's office, file cabinets stood empty with their drawers pulled completely out, as if someone had removed documents in great haste. Most telling of all, the convent's telephone had been ripped from the wall, its cord severed as if to prevent any outgoing calls. The more Jake observed, the more convinced he became that the nuns' disappearance had been neither voluntary nor peaceful. The evidence pointed to a group of frightened women who had barricaded themselves inside their sanctuary before ultimately fleeing into the night. But what had driven them to such desperate measures? And more importantly, what had happened to them after they left St. Magdalene's? Jake's grandmother had been one of the last people in Millfield to see the nuns before their disappearance. Her grocery store had been a regular stop for Sister Catherine, who handled most of the convent's shopping duties. According to family stories, Sister Catherine's final visit had been markedly different from her usual cheerful interactions. She'd been nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, and had purchased an unusual quantity of non-perishable foods, as if preparing for a long journey or an extended period of hiding. She asked me about bus schedules, Jake's grandmother had recalled years later. Wanted to know about routes that went out of state, places where someone could disappear without leaving traces. I thought it was odd at the time, but I didn't want to pry into church business. Maybe I should have asked more questions. The guilt in his grandmother's voice had been evident even decades after the fact. Like many residents of Millfield, she'd sensed that something was wrong, but had chosen to mind her own business rather than interfere with religious matters. The community's respect for the church had prevented anyone from asking the hard questions that might have uncovered the truth about what happened to the 5 missing women. Jake returned to the chapel and sat in one of the front pews, the diaries, weight heavy against his chest. Sister Catherine's entries had mentioned other people by name, Father Mackenzie, whose unusual requests had caused such distress, and various church officials who had visited the convent during those final months. Jake wondered if any of these individuals were still alive, still in positions where they might face consequences if the truth about 1984 finally came to light. The renovation project suddenly seemed less like construction work and more like a dangerous excavation. Jake realized that by discovering the diary, he'd inherited the same terrible knowledge that had driven 5 nuns to flee in terror. The question now was whether he had the courage to follow their example of trying to expose the truth, or whether he should protect himself by reburying their secrets as deeply as they'd been hidden for the past 4 decades. His phone buzzed with a text message from his foreman, asking about the day's work priorities. Jake stared at the mundane question, struck by the surreal contrast between his ordinary construction duties and the explosive evidence he now carried. How was he supposed to focus on electrical wiring and flooring installation when he held proof of a 40-year-old conspiracy that had cost 5 women their lives? Jake walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful countryside surrounding St. Magdalene's. The convent sat on 50 acres of rolling hills, far enough from town to provide privacy, but close enough that screams should have been heard if something violent had occurred here. Yet the isolation also made it an ideal location for activities that certain people wanted to keep hidden from public view. Sister Catherine's diary entries had hinted at visitors who came to the convent under unusual circumstances, meetings that took place late at night or early in the morning when the community would normally be engaged in prayers or rest. She'd written about voices heard through walls, conversations that the nuns weren't meant to overhear, and the growing realization that their sanctuary had been corrupted by forces beyond their understanding or control. One entry from August 1984 had been particularly disturbing. The sounds from the basement continue each night. Sister Mary Frances insists we must investigate, but I fear what we might find. Father Mackenzie's warnings about interfering in matters beyond our comprehension have become more threatening than protective. We are trapped between our duty to God and our duty to preserve our own lives. Jake hadn't yet explored the convent's basement levels during his renovation survey. The diocese had indicated that the underground areas were structurally sound, but would not be part of the community center conversion. Now he wondered what those lower levels might contain, what evidence might still exist of the activities that had terrified 5 devoted women into abandoning their vows and their home. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the chapel, windows casting long shadows across the floor where Jake sat contemplating his next move. His construction crew would arrive soon, and he would need to decide whether to continue with the renovation as planned or find a way to halt the project until he could properly investigate what he'd discovered. The diary represented more than just historical curiosity. It was evidence of a crime that had never been reported, investigated, or resolved. 5 women had vanished, their fate unknown, their story deliberately buried by people with the power and authority to make inconvenient truths disappear. Jake realized that he now held the key to potentially solving one of Millfield's most enduring mysteries, but he also understood that pursuing that truth might put him in the same danger that had claimed the nuns 40 years earlier. As he sat in the empty chapel, surrounded by the ghosts of prayers offered by women who had died trying to expose evil, Jake Morrison made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He couldn't simply ignore what he'd found and continue with the renovation as if nothing had happened. The 5 nuns of St. Magdalene's deserved justice, even if it came 4 decades too late, and their courage in trying to reveal the truth demanded that someone finally finish what they had started. But Jake also understood that he couldn't pursue this investigation alone. The forces that had silenced 5 religious women would not hesitate to deal with a construction worker who asked too many questions. He would need allies, people with the resources and authority to properly investigate what had happened at St. Magdalene's during those terrifying final months of 1984. The question was who he could trust with information that might still be dangerous, enough to kill for, and whether anyone would believe the incredible story contained within Sister Catherine's diary. Detective Sarah Castellanos had spent 18 years working cases in Philadelphia before accepting a transfer to the quieter jurisdiction of Millfield County, seeking a slower pace and smaller caseload that would allow her more time with her teenage daughter Emma. At 45, Sarah thought she'd seen every type of crime and corruption that human nature could produce. But the small, rural community had proven surprisingly complex beneath its peaceful facade. Drug trafficking routes ran through the county's back roads. Domestic violence cases often involved prominent local families, and the interconnected relationships between longtime residents created investigative challenges that big city policing had never prepared her for. Sarah's interest in historical crimes had developed during her years in Philadelphia, where she'd worked several cold cases involving missing persons from decades past. She understood how time could both obscure evidence and reveal new leads as witnesses aged, died, or finally found the courage to speak truths they'd kept hidden for years. The techniques for investigating old crimes required patience, intuition, and a willingness to dig through layers of carefully constructed lies that had calcified into accepted community mythology. When Jake Morrison called the county sheriff's office, requesting to speak with a detective about something historical and potentially criminal related to his renovation work at St. Magdalene's Convent, Sarah's curiosity was immediately piqued. She'd heard whispered references to the missing nuns during her 3 years in Millfield, but the story had always been presented as a sad but unremarkable tale of religious women being transferred to foreign missions. The fact that a construction worker was asking for a detective rather than a historian suggested there might be more to the story than local folklore acknowledged. Sarah drove out to the convent on a grey November morning, the autumn landscape stark and unwelcoming under overcast skies. She'd done some preliminary research before the meeting, reviewing what little documentation existed about the 1984 disappearance of the 5 nuns. The official records were frustratingly sparse. A brief newspaper article about the sisters being reassigned to missions abroad, a few administrative documents from the diocese, and virtually no police reports or investigative files. For 5 people to simply vanish from a small community without generating significant paperwork struck Sarah as highly unusual. The convent building itself was impressive despite its obvious abandonment, a 3-story stone structure that spoke of a time when religious orders commanded significant resources and community respect. Jake Morrison met her at the main entrance, a weathered man in his 40s whose nervous energy suggested he'd stumbled onto something far more significant than routine construction work. His calloused hands shook slightly as he led her through the building's corridors, pointing out various aspects of the renovation project while clearly building up to whatever revelation had prompted his call. "I need to show you something," Jake said as they entered the main chapel. "But before I do, I want you to understand that I'm not some conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. I've been doing construction work for 20 years, and I know the difference between old building quirks and evidence that someone was trying to hide something." Sarah nodded, her detective instincts already alert to the serious tone in Jake's voice. She watched as he approached the ornate altar and demonstrated how he'd discovered the hidden compartment, showing her the careful craftsmanship that had concealed the space and the obvious intention to protect whatever had been stored inside. When Jake produced the leather-bound diary and placed it in her hands, Sarah felt the familiar electric sensation that came with touching a piece of evidence that might crack open a long-dormant case. The diary's weight and texture spoke of authenticity, and Sister Catherine's handwriting showed the evolution from careful penmanship to increasingly frantic scrawls that Sarah recognized as signs of mounting stress and fear. As she read selected passages that Jake had marked with paper scraps, Sarah's professional skepticism began to give way to growing alarm. This wasn't the record of a peaceful religious community preparing for reassignment to foreign missions. This was the testimony of women who had discovered something terrible and were documenting their fears in case they didn't survive to tell their story in person. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Sarah asked, closing the diary carefully and studying Jake's face for signs of deception or exaggeration. "You're the first person I've told," Jake replied. "I thought about calling the diocese, but something in Sister Catherine's writing made me think that might not be safe. She mentions being afraid of Father Mackenzie and other church officials. If they were involved in whatever happened, then reporting to church authorities might just be putting the evidence back in the hands of the people who wanted it buried." Sarah appreciated Jake's caution. Too many potential witnesses over the years had destroyed their own cases by alerting the wrong people to what they'd discovered. The fact that Jake had instinctively understood the need for discretion suggested he grasped the seriousness of what he'd found. "What do you know about the circumstances of their disappearance?" Sarah asked. "I've read the official accounts, but I'm more interested in what people in town actually remember." Jake told her about his grandmother's memories of Sister Catherine's final visit to the grocery store, the nuns' obvious nervousness, and questions about bus routes to out-of-state destinations. He described finding the unfinished letter in Sister Catherine's cell, the evidence of hasty departure throughout the convent, and the physical signs suggesting the nuns had been trying to secure themselves against some threat before ultimately fleeing. As Sarah listened, she began constructing a timeline of events that painted a very different picture from the official narrative. Rather than a planned transfer to foreign missions, the evidence suggested 5 women who had discovered something that put them in immediate danger, leading to a desperate escape that had somehow been covered up and explained away by church authorities. "I want to examine the rest of the building," Sarah said. "If Sister Catherine's diary is accurate, there might be other evidence that was overlooked during the original, whatever investigation took place in 1984. Jake led her through the convent's upper floors, pointing out details he'd noticed during his renovation work. In the dormitory area, Sarah observed the unmade beds, personal items left behind, and the general signs of rapid departure that Jake had described. But her trained eye also caught things that Jake's construction background had missed. Scuff marks on walls that suggested furniture had been moved to barricade doors, scratch marks around window latches indicating attempts to secure the building, and most significantly, what appeared to be dried bloodstains on the floor of one corridor that had darkened with age, but was still visible to someone who knew what to look for. "When was the last time anyone from the diocese visited this building?" Sarah asked. "They came by once when I started the project to show me which areas were off-limits," Jake replied, "but that was 3 weeks ago before I found the diary. The basement levels were specifically mentioned as places I shouldn't go, supposedly, for structural safety reasons." Sarah's investigative instincts immediately focused on the areas Jake had been told to avoid. In her experience, people who wanted to hide evidence often used safety concerns as cover for keeping investigators away from crucial locations. The basement of St. Magdalene's suddenly became a priority for examination. "Do you have access to those lower levels?" she asked. Jake nodded, producing a set of keys that included access to all areas of the building. "The diocese gave me master keys for the renovation. They said the basement restrictions were just recommendations, not absolute prohibitions." Sarah smiled grimly. "Sometimes the best evidence was found in the places where people thought it was safely hidden. The basement of St. Magdalene's was accessed through a heavy wooden door near the convent's kitchen area. Jake had to force the lock, which appeared to have been unused for decades, the metal mechanism corroded with age and neglect. As they descended the stone steps into the underground areas, Sarah's flashlight beam revealed a maze of interconnected rooms that had clearly served multiple purposes during the convent's active years. Storage rooms filled with dust-covered furniture, and boxes lined one corridor, while another led to what appeared to be a workshop area with tools and equipment that suggested the nuns had been largely self-sufficient in maintaining their facility. But it was the third corridor that immediately caught Sarah's attention, a passage that led to a series of rooms that seemed different in both construction and purpose from the utilitarian storage areas. These rooms had been fitted with soundproofing, materials that were clearly not original to the building's 1920s construction. Heavy curtains still hung from ceiling-mounted tracks, and the floors showed wear patterns that suggested frequent use by multiple people. Most disturbing of all, several rooms contained what appeared to be restraint devices, metal rings bolted to walls, chains that served no obvious maintenance purpose, and furniture that seemed designed for confinement rather than comfort. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his voice echoing in the underground chamber. "What the hell was going on down here?" Sarah examined the restraint devices with growing horror, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible explanations for their presence. The soundproofing, the secrecy, the isolation of the convent's location, all of it pointed to activities that would require complete privacy and the assurance that no cries for help would be heard by anyone who might intervene. In one of the basement rooms, Sarah found evidence that someone had attempted to clean up hastily before abandoning the space. Bleach stains on the concrete floor formed patterns that suggested someone had tried to destroy biological evidence, but the cleaning had been incomplete or rushed. Dark stains remained in corners and cracks where cleaning solutions hadn't penetrated, and Sarah's experienced eye immediately recognized them as likely blood evidence. "We need to stop touching things and call for a full forensics team," Sarah said, her professional training overriding her investigative curiosity. "This is a crime scene, possibly multiple crime scenes, and we've already contaminated more evidence than I'm comfortable with." Jake backed away from the restraint devices he'd been examining, suddenly aware of the potential significance of their fingerprints on surfaces that might hold crucial evidence. "How long do you think this stuff has been down here?" Sarah studied the wear patterns, the age of the soundproofing materials, and the general condition of the restraint devices. "Decades, maybe since the convent was built, or at least since the 1960s. This wasn't a recent installation. Someone put a lot of time and money into creating these rooms for a specific purpose." The implications were staggering. If the basement rooms had been used for the activities that their appearance suggested, then St. Magdalene's Convent had been the site of systematic abuse that had gone on for years, possibly decades. The 5 nuns who disappeared in 1984 hadn't just stumbled onto administrative corruption or financial impropriety. They'd discovered evidence of crimes that would have destroyed careers, ended lives, and brought down powerful people throughout the church hierarchy. Sister Catherine's diary entries suddenly made perfect sense. The knowledge that cannot be borne, the sounds from the basement, the increasing visits from Father Mackenzie and other officials, all of it fit the pattern of a cover-up operation designed to silence witnesses to ongoing criminal activity. "We need to get out of here and secure this scene immediately," Sarah said, leading Jake back toward the basement stairs, "and we need to assume that there are people still alive who would prefer that what we've found today never comes to light." As they climbed back toward the main level of the convent, Sarah's mind raced through the implications of their discovery. A case she'd expected to be a straightforward historical investigation had just become an active criminal matter with potential suspects who might still be in positions of power and influence. The 5 missing nuns weren't just victims of a 40-year-old crime. They were witnesses whose testimony, even decades after their deaths, could still destroy the people responsible for their disappearance. Sarah's phone showed no signal in the basement levels, but as soon as they reached the main floor, she began making the calls that would transform Jake's renovation project into one of the most significant criminal investigations in Millfield County's history. The forensics team, the coroner's office, the state police, all would need to be involved in processing what they'd discovered beneath St. Magdalene's. But even as she organized the official response, Sarah knew that the real challenge would be identifying and pursuing suspects who had spent 4 decades believing their crimes were safely buried with their victims. The discovery of Sister Catherine's diary and the basement torture chambers meant that someone who thought they'd gotten away with murder was about to learn that their past had finally caught up with them. Jake stood quietly beside her as she made call after call, the weight of their discovery settling over both of them like a heavy blanket. They'd come to the convent expecting to find explanations for a historical mystery, but instead They'd uncovered evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy that stretched back decades and potentially reached into the highest levels of local religious and political authority. The renovation of St. Magdalene's was over before it had truly begun. But the investigation into what had happened within those walls was just getting started. The first person Detective Sarah Castellanos called was County Sheriff Robert Hayes, a man whose 30-year career in law enforcement had made him both cautious and politically astute. Hayes understood better than most how investigations involving religious institutions could explode into media circuses that destroyed careers and divided communities along lines that took decades to heal. When Sarah described what she and Jake had discovered at St. Magdalene's, the long silence on the other end of the phone told her that Hayes was calculating not just the criminal implications, but the political earthquake that would follow any formal investigation. "You're absolutely certain about what you found down there?" Hayes asked finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew that the next few decisions would define the remainder of his career. "Sheriff, I've processed enough crime scenes to know the difference between old basement storage and purpose-built torture chambers," Sarah replied. "Someone spent considerable time and money creating those rooms, and they weren't designed for storing church supplies." Hayes agreed to come out to St. Magdalene's immediately, but his tone carried warnings about the need for absolute discretion until they could determine the full scope of what they were dealing with. Sarah understood the subtext. If powerful people were involved in covering up decades-old crimes, then moving too quickly or involving the wrong agencies could result in evidence disappearing and witnesses developing sudden memory problems. While waiting for the sheriff's arrival, Sarah walked through the convent's main level again, this time looking for any evidence that might connect the basement activities to specific individuals or time periods. In the Mother Superior's abandoned office, she found filing cabinets that Jake had assumed were empty, but which actually contained documents that had been overlooked during the hasty evacuation. Most were routine administrative records, but buried. Among supply orders and maintenance schedules were visitor logs that documented who had come to the convent during the months leading up to the nuns' disappearance. The names in those logs read like a directory of Millfield's religious and civic establishment. Father Mackenzie appeared multiple times, as expected from Sister Catherine's diary references, but so did Mayor Thomas Brennan, Judge William Morrison, and several prominent local businessmen whose families had been pillars of the community for generations. Most disturbing of all were entries that simply read "private retreat," with dates but no names, suggesting activities that required complete anonymity, even in internal church records. "Jake!" Sarah called over to where the construction worker was examining the chapel's structural damage with new eyes, seeing it now as potential evidence rather than renovation challenges. "Do you recognize any of these names from the visitor logs?" Jake studied the list, his face growing pale as he recognized several entries. "Judge Morrison was my uncle," he said quietly. "He died about 10 years ago, but there were always whispers about him in the family, things that people didn't talk about directly, but everyone seemed to understand that Uncle Bill had problems with boundaries around kids." The family connection hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd grown up hearing vague warnings about staying away from Uncle Bill's house, instructions that had seemed like typical family dysfunction rather than protection from a predator. Now, seeing his uncle's name in the St. Magdalene's visitor logs, Jake realized that his family's whispered concerns might have been reactions to knowledge of much darker activities. "There are 12 different names that appear regularly throughout 1984, Sarah continued, studying the logs. "Some come weekly, others monthly, but all of them were here frequently enough to suggest ongoing involvement rather than casual visits. The pattern that emerged from the visitor logs was deeply disturbing. The men whose names appeared most frequently were all in positions of authority or trust. Clergy, judges, politicians, and business leaders who would have had both the power to cover up criminal activity and access to vulnerable victims who couldn't report abuse without facing retaliation or disbelief. Sheriff Hayes arrived within an hour, bringing with him a small forensics team and a demeanor that suggested he'd spent the drive preparing for the worst-case scenario. Sarah led him through the same discovery process she'd experienced with Jake, watching Hayes's expression grow increasingly grim as they moved from the diary evidence to the basement torture chambers. "How many people know about this?" Hayes asked, after examining the restraint devices and blood-stained floors. "Just the three of us," Sarah replied. "I haven't filed any reports yet, and Jake hasn't spoken to anyone else." Hayes nodded approvingly. "We need to keep it that way until we understand what we're dealing with. If even half of what these logs suggest is true, then we're looking at a conspiracy that involves some of the most powerful people in county history." The sheriff's caution wasn't just political calculation. It was recognition that investigating crimes involving such prominent figures would require extraordinary care to ensure that evidence wasn't compromised and witnesses weren't intimidated into silence. Hayes had seen too many cases involving powerful defendants where crucial evidence mysteriously disappeared or key witnesses suddenly refused to cooperate. "What's our next step?" Jake asked, clearly struggling with the realization that his family might have been connected to the horrors they'd uncovered. "We secure this scene completely and begin a very careful investigation," Hayes replied. "But we also need to assume that some of the people involved in the original cover-up are still alive and still in positions where they could interfere with our work." The forensics team began processing the basement levels while Sarah and Hayes discussed how to approach the investigation without alerting potential suspects or their allies. The visitor logs provided a starting point, but they would need to verify which of the named individuals were still alive and what positions they currently held in the community. "We also need to consider the possibility that some of our own colleagues might be compromised," Hayes said quietly, voicing the concern that Sarah had already been contemplating. "If this conspiracy has been protected for 40 years, it's because people in law enforcement and other agencies have been either bought off or intimidated into silence." The paranoia was justified but complicating. How could they investigate crimes that might involve judges, prosecutors, and police officials without using the very systems that might be compromised? Sarah realized they would need to operate with extreme discretion, building their case carefully before revealing it to anyone who might have conflicts of interest. Jake's phone rang, startling all three of them in the tense atmosphere of the crime scene. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Mr. Morrison, this is Father Thomas Mackenzie from the Diocese of Millfield. I understand you've been doing some renovation work at St. Magdalene's. I wonder if we might schedule a meeting to discuss your progress and address any concerns that might have arisen during your work." The timing was too coincidental to be innocent. Somehow Father Mackenzie had learned about their discovery within hours of Sarah and Hayes arriving at the convent. Jake looked at the detective and sheriff, both of whom were listening intently to his side of the conversation. "I'm pretty busy with the construction work right now," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe we could schedule something for next week." "I'm afraid this matter requires more immediate attention," Father Mackenzie pressed. "There are certain aspects of the convent's history that outsiders might misunderstand. It would be better for everyone if we could discuss these matters privately before any unfortunate misinterpretations spread through the community." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Father Mackenzie was offering Jake a chance to stay quiet in exchange for avoiding unfortunate misinterpretations, a clear indication that the priest knew exactly what had been discovered and was prepared. to take action to protect himself and his co-conspirators. "Let me check my calendar and get back to you," Jake said, ending the call before the priest could apply more pressure. "How the hell did he know we were here?" Sarah asked. But even as she spoke, she was scanning the convent's exterior for signs that they were being watched. The isolated location that had once provided privacy for criminal activities now left them exposed and vulnerable to surveillance. Hayes was already on his radio, calling for additional units to secure the perimeter around St. Magdalene's. "If Father Mackenzie knows we're here, then others probably know too. We need to assume that we're dealing with people who have been protecting these secrets for decades and won't hesitate to protect them now." The investigation that had begun as a historical curiosity about missing nuns had suddenly become an urgent matter of personal safety. Jake realized that by discovering Sister Catherine's diary, he'd inherited the same dangerous knowledge that had driven 5 women to flee in terror 40 years earlier. The only difference was that now the people responsible for their disappearance knew that their crimes had been uncovered. Sarah studied the visitor logs again, cross-referencing the names with her knowledge of current local politics and law enforcement. Several of the men listed were indeed dead, but others had sons or associates who now held positions of influence. The conspiracy that had silenced the nuns in 1984 might have evolved over the decades, but it clearly retained enough power to track their current investigation and respond within hours. "We need to move fast," Hayes decided. "Whatever evidence we're going to collect from this scene needs to be secured immediately before someone decides that another unfortunate accident might solve their problems." The sheriff's words carried the implication that the 5 missing nuns might not have simply fled into hiding. They might have been murdered to ensure their silence. If that was true, then Jake, Sarah, and Hayes had just placed themselves in the same deadly position that had claimed the lives of 5 innocent women 4 decades earlier. As the forensics team worked to document the basement crime scenes, Sarah found herself thinking about Sister Catherine's final diary entry, the bone-chilling words that had convinced Jake to call for help rather than simply resealing the hidden compartment. Whatever Sister Catherine had written in those last, desperate moments, it had been important enough for someone to risk everything to keep it buried. Now that same information was about to come to light, and the people who had killed to protect it were preparing to kill again. Detective Sarah Castellanos knew that Father Mackenzie's phone call had transformed their investigation from a cold case into an active threat. The priest's knowledge of Jake's discovery meant that someone had been monitoring the convent, either through direct surveillance or through contacts within law enforcement agencies that should have been trusted allies. Sarah's years of experience with corruption cases had taught her that the most dangerous investigations were those where the criminals had advance warning and time to prepare countermeasures. Sheriff Hayes made the decision to accelerate their evidence collection, bringing in additional forensics personnel from the state police to process the basement crime scenes before anyone could interfere. But even as crime scene technicians photographed restraint devices and collected blood samples, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes that had been protecting these secrets for far too long. The visitor logs from 1984 provided a roadmap for understanding how the conspiracy had operated, but Sarah needed to determine which participants were still alive and potentially dangerous. She began cross-referencing the names with current obituaries, property records, and professional licensing databases, building a profile of surviving co-conspirators who might be motivated to silence new witnesses, just as they had silenced the 5 nuns decades earlier. Mayor Thomas Brennan had died in 2019, but his son Michael now served as the county's district attorney. Judge William Morrison had passed away 10 years ago, as Jake had mentioned, but his judicial seat was now occupied by his former law clerk, Judge Patricia Hendricks, who had worked closely with Morrison for over 15 years before his death. Most concerning of all, Father Mackenzie remained active in the diocese, having been promoted to Monsignor and given supervisory authority over multiple parishes throughout the region. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. Rather than dying out with its original participants, the conspiracy appeared to have been passed down through professional and personal relationships that ensured its continuation across generations. Sons inherited their father's secrets along with their positions of power. Protégés learned to maintain their mentors' cover-ups, and institutional loyalties trumped legal obligations to report criminal activity. Sarah's investigation hit its first major obstacle when she attempted to access police records from 1984 that might document the official response to the Nuns' disappearance. The files that should have contained investigative reports, witness statements, and evidence logs were missing from both physical and digital archives. When Sarah contacted the records department about the missing documentation, she was told that many files from the 1980s had been lost during a computer system upgrade several years earlier. The convenient disappearance of crucial records confirmed Sarah's suspicions that people within law enforcement had been complicit in the original cover-up and were continuing to protect the conspiracy by eliminating evidence that might expose their involvement. The systematic destruction of documentation suggested a level of institutional corruption that went far beyond individual bad actors. Jake Morrison found himself struggling with the realization that his family might have been connected to the horrors uncovered at St. Magdalene's. His uncle's presence in the visitor logs forced him to re-evaluate childhood memories that had seemed innocuous at the time, but now carried sinister implications. Family gatherings, where Uncle Bill had insisted on taking children aside for private conversations, unexplained tensions between his parents and his uncle, warnings about staying away from certain places or people, all of these memories took on new meaning in light of what they discovered. The psychological impact of learning that a family member might have been involved in systematic abuse was devastating for Jake. He'd grown up believing that his uncle was simply an eccentric, judge with boundary issues, never imagining that the whispered family concerns might have been reactions to knowledge of criminal activity. The possibility that his relatives had known about abuse but remained silent to protect family reputation added another layer of guilt and confusion to Jake's emotional turmoil. Sarah recognized the signs of secondary trauma in Jake's behavior and knew that maintaining his cooperation would require careful handling of his emotional state. Witnesses who discovered family connections to criminal conspiracies often experienced psychological breakdown that made them unreliable or caused them to withdraw from investigations entirely. She needed Jake's continued involvement both as the person who discovered the diary and as someone with potential access to family information that might provide additional leads. The forensics team's preliminary findings from the basement confirmed Sarah's worst fears about what had occurred at St. Magdalene's. Blood evidence matched multiple individuals, suggesting that numerous victims had been tortured in the underground chambers over an extended period. DNA analysis would take weeks to complete, but the initial results indicated that some of the blood evidence was relatively recent, possibly within the last 20 years, meaning that the criminal activity had continued long after the nuns' disappearance. The discovery that crimes had continued into the modern era fundamentally changed the nature of their investigation. This wasn't just a cold case about historical injustices. It was evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy that might still be claiming victims. Sarah realized that somewhere in the region, There might be recent survivors who could provide testimony about contemporary abuse, but identifying and protecting these witnesses would require extreme caution to prevent them from meeting the same fate as the 5 nuns. Sheriff Hayes convened a secure meeting with Sarah and Jake at an undisclosed location away from any government buildings that might be compromised by surveillance or insider threats. The sheriff's paranoia had proven justified when his routine background check on Father Mackenzie revealed that the priest had been receiving regular updates about the investigation from someone within the county sheriff's department. Hayes realized that their internal communications had been compromised from the beginning, forcing them to operate with the assumption that any information shared through official channels would immediately reach the people they were investigating. "We need to bring in federal authorities," Hayes decided after reviewing the forensics preliminary report. "This conspiracy crosses state lines and involves federal crimes that are beyond our jurisdiction to prosecute effectively." Sarah agreed with the assessment, but worried about the timing of federal involvement. FBI investigations moved slowly and bureaucratically, following procedures that might allow evidence to be destroyed or witnesses to be intimidated while agents worked through proper channels. The immediate threat to their safety suggested that they needed protection and resources that local law enforcement couldn't provide, but federal agents would also bring their own security risks and political considerations. Jake's phone rang again, showing another call from Father Mackenzie. This time, the priest's tone was more urgent and less diplomatic than their previous conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm disappointed that you haven't returned my calls. There are people in this community who are very concerned about the direction your renovation work has taken. Perhaps it would be wise for you to consider whether continuing this project is in your best interests." The threat was no longer subtle. Father Mackenzie was making it clear that Jake's safety depended on his willingness to abandon the investigation and keep quiet about what he discovered. The priest's confidence in making such blatant threats suggested that he believed his organization still had enough power to eliminate problems through intimidation or violence. "I appreciate your concern, Father, but I have a job to finish," Jake replied, following Sarah's earlier coaching about how to respond without escalating the situation or revealing their investigative progress. "Jobs can be finished in many different ways, Mr. Morrison. Sometimes it's better to declare a project complete rather than dig too deeply into foundations that might be unstable. I hope you'll consider that advice carefully." After ending the call, Jake looked visibly shaken by the priest's increasingly direct threats. Sarah realized that they needed to move quickly to either place Jake in protective custody or provide him with security that would ensure his safety. While the investigation continued, the visitor logs revealed another disturbing pattern that Sarah had initially overlooked. Several entries documented visits by groups of men rather than individuals, with notations like annual retreat or special services that suggested organized activities involving multiple participants. The dates of these group visits corresponded with times when Sister Catherine's diary entries indicated particularly high levels of stress and fear among the nuns. Sarah began to understand that St. Magdalene's had been used as a venue for organized abuse involving networks of powerful men who participated in group activities that required absolute secrecy and complete control over potential witnesses. The systematic nature of the abuse, the sophisticated soundproofing, and the careful documentation in visitor logs suggested that this wasn't random criminal activity, but rather an organized operation that had been planned and executed with military precision. The realization that they were dealing with an organized abuse network rather than individual criminals significantly raised the stakes of their investigation. Networks of this type typically had extensive resources, political connections, and proven willingness to eliminate threats through any means necessary. The 5 nuns had discovered evidence of organized criminal conspiracy and had been silenced before they could expose it to authorities who might have been trustworthy. Hayes received word from his contacts in the state police that their request for federal assistance had been forwarded to appropriate agencies. But the bureaucratic process would take several days to complete. In the meantime, they would need to continue gathering evidence while protecting themselves from retaliation by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets. Sarah studied Sister Catherine's diary, again focusing on the final entries that Jake had been too disturbed to read completely. The nuns' last words provided specific details about the abuse network's operations, naming individuals and describing activities that would be crucial evidence in any future prosecutions. But Sister Catherine's final entry also contained information that explained why the nuns had been forced to flee rather than report their discoveries to authorities. The diary's last page revealed that the abuse network included members of law, enforcement, and the judicial system who would have been responsible for investigating any reports of criminal activity. Sister Catherine had realized that the very people who should have protected abuse victims were actually participants in the conspiracy, making it impossible to seek help through official channels without alerting the criminals to the nuns' knowledge. Day 5 women had found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. They possessed evidence of horrific crimes, but had no safe way to report what they'd discovered without signing their own death warrants. Sister Catherine's final diary entry, dated October 12, 1984, contained details so horrific that Sarah had to read it twice before the full implications sank in. The nun's handwriting was barely legible, written in obvious haste and terror, but her words painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond what they had already discovered in the basement chambers. Tonight, we witnessed something that has shattered our faith in everything we believed about this holy place, Sister Catherine had written. The sounds from below drew Sister Mary Frances and myself to investigate despite our fears. What we saw through the basement window will haunt us until our dying day. Father Mackenzie was there, along with Judge Morrison, Mayor Brennan, and others whose faces we recognized from Sunday services. They were not alone. There were children, some no older than 10 or 12, brought here against their will for purposes and too evil to describe in detail. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued reading Sister Catherine's account of that final night. The nun described how she and Sister Mary Frances had watched in horror as prominent community leaders participated in ritualized abuse of children who had clearly been trafficked specifically for these gatherings. The systematic nature of the operation, the careful scheduling in visitor logs, the soundproofed basement chambers, everything had been designed to facilitate organized exploitation of vulnerable victims. We confronted Father Mackenzie this morning, demanding that he report these crimes to proper authorities, the diary continued. His response chilled us to our bones. He laughed and asked us who we thought would believe the word of 5 hysterical nuns against pillars of the community. He reminded us that Judge Morrison would hear any criminal complaints, that Mayor Brennan controlled the police department, and that the district attorney was a frequent visitor to our special services. We are trapped in a web of corruption that reaches into every institution that should protect the innocent. The entry concluded with Sister Catherine's desperate plan for the nuns to flee St. Magdalene's that very night, taking with them whatever evidence they could gather to eventually expose the conspiracy to federal authorities or journalists who might be beyond the reach of local corruption. But Sister Catherine's final words revealed that she suspected their escape attempt might fail. If something happens to us, if we disappear or die in convenient accidents, know that we tried to save those children. The diary hidden behind the altar contains everything we've learned. May God forgive us for our silence, and may someone with more courage than we possessed finish what we could not. Jake Morrison read the final entry with growing horror, finally understanding the full scope of what his uncle and the other men had been involved in at St. Magdalene's. The realization that children had been systematically abused, and possibly murdered in the basement chambers where he'd been working, made him physically ill. The renovation project that had started as routine construction work had become a descent into the darkest corners of human evil. Sheriff Hayes contacted the FBI field office in Philadelphia immediately after reviewing Sister Catherine's complete account. The involvement of organized child trafficking and the murder of witnesses elevated the case to federal jurisdiction. But Hayes also knew that even federal agencies might be compromised if the conspiracy had evolved over 40 years to include connections beyond Millfield County. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez arrived from Philadelphia within hours of Hayes's call, bringing with her a small team of investigators who specialized in historical abuse cases and organized crime. Rodriguez had spent 15 years working cases involving institutional cover-ups and understood the challenges of investigating crimes where the perpetrators had decades to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. The diary alone provides enough evidence for federal charges against anyone still alive, Rodriguez told the assembled group, but we need to determine which of these men are still living and what positions of power they currently hold. We also need to locate any surviving victims who might be willing to testify. The investigation expanded rapidly as Rodriguez's team began cross-referencing the 1984 visitor logs with current databases of registered sex offenders, missing persons reports, and unsolved murders throughout the region. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Dozens of children had disappeared from the area during the 1970s and 1980s, most from foster care systems or troubled families, where their absence might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. Jake's cooperation proved crucial as he provided family information that helped investigators understand how the conspiracy had operated and evolved. His uncle's personal papers, discovered in the judge's estate files, contained additional evidence of the abuse network, including photographs and financial records that documented payments to various participants and suppliers of victims. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez's team located Margaret Donnelly, now 53 years old, who had been one of the children trafficked to St. Magdalene's in 1983. Margaret had suppressed memories of her abuse for decades, but the news coverage of the investigation triggered flashbacks that led her to contact federal authorities with detailed testimony about the organized abuse she had suffered. "I was 12 when they brought me there," Margaret told investigators during a carefully conducted interview. "I'd been in foster care, and my caseworker said I was going to a special program run by the church. Instead, they took me to that basement and..." Margaret's testimony provided corroborating evidence for Sister Catherine's diary entries and established a pattern of systematic exploitation that had continued for years. Margaret's courage in coming forward inspired other survivors to contact authorities. Within 2 weeks, federal investigators had testimony from 7 adult survivors who had been abused at St. Magdalene's during the 1970s and 1980s. Their accounts painted a horrific picture of organized exploitation that had claimed dozens of young victims over more than a decade. The arrests began in early December 2024. Monsignor Thomas Mackenzie was taken into custody at his rectory, charged with conspiracy, child trafficking, and accessory to murder in the deaths of the 5 nuns. District Attorney Michael Brennan was arrested at his office, facing charges related to obstruction of justice and covering up his father's involvement in the original conspiracy. Judge Patricia Hendricks was removed from the bench pending investigation of her role in destroying court records that might have exposed the abuse network. Jake Morrison found himself serving as a key witness in what became the largest organized abuse prosecution in Pennsylvania history. His discovery of Sister Catherine's diary had finally given voice to victims who had been silenced for 40 years, bringing justice for crimes that powerful people had believed would remain buried forever. The basement chambers at St. Magdalene's were excavated by forensic archaeologists who discovered the remains of 3 children who had been murdered to prevent them from reporting their abuse. DNA evidence linked these victims to several of the arrested conspirators, providing additional charges that would ensure lengthy prison sentences for those found guilty. Sarah Castellanos received commendation from federal authorities for her careful handling of the initial investigation, but she found the personal cost of uncovering such horrific crimes to be almost overwhelming. The knowledge that children had suffered and died while powerful people protected their abusers challenged her faith in law enforcement and institutional justice. The trial of the surviving conspirators lasted 8 months, with testimony from survivors, forensic experts, and investigators painting a complete picture of the organized abuse network that had operated at St. Magdalene's. Sister Catherine's diary served as crucial evidence, finally allowing the 5 murdered nuns to speak from beyond the grave about the horrors they had witnessed and the courage they had shown in trying to protect innocent children. Monsignor Mackenzie was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for his role in organizing the abuse network and ordering the murders of the 5 nuns. District Attorney Brennan received 25 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Judge Hendricks was convicted of tampering with evidence and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The St. Magdalene's case led to broader investigations of institutional abuse throughout Pennsylvania, resulting in dozens of additional arrests and convictions. The courage shown by survivors in coming forward inspired legislative changes that extended statutes of limitations for abuse cases and strengthened protections for witnesses in institutional crime cases. Jake Morrison never completed the renovation of St. Magdalene's Convent. The building was eventually demolished, and the site became a memorial garden dedicated to the 5 nuns who died trying to protect children and to all victims of institutional abuse. A bronze plaque bears Sister Catherine's final words: "May someone with more courage than we possessed finish what we could not." The investigation that began with a construction worker's curiosity about a hidden diary became a testament to the power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to bury it. Sister Catherine Brennan, Sister Mary Frances, Sister Elizabeth Carmel, Sister Rose Margaret, and Sister Anna Teresa had finally received the justice they died seeking, 40 years after their voices were silenced by those who thought evil could be hidden forever. Their story serves as a reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are made by ordinary people who refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths. Jake Morrison's decision to call Detective Castellanos instead of simply resealing the hidden compartment made all the difference between justice delayed and justice forever denied. If stories like this one inspire you to learn more about how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of courage, justice, and the triumph of truth over those who would bury it in darkness.